Hi everyone, I'm Kay, and this is Kay Talks Writing, where I take what I've learned and experienced in my life as a writer and do my best to compress some part of it into a 10-minute drabble that can help you become better at this wonderful art right away. So far, we've talked a lot about how to shape your story in general, and I've given a lot of words to, I think, how to negotiate the relationship between the writerly mind and inspiration and the process of that becoming words on the page. And most recently, I've talked about planning and deciding on your pacing. But at some point, you do need to start writing, so it's time to begin our beginnings and look at what goes on that first page. Beginnings are incredibly difficult. If you're the kind of writer that is intimidated by your stories or has to find the right headspace to write, then beginnings are probably the hardest time to get yourself in front of a keyboard or a blank page and start putting words down. It's also difficult to get right, and if I'm being honest, most of us are probably going to write pretty terrible first pages on most of our first tries. Some solace then for you who are afraid to do it. If it helps, just assume you'll be cutting that first page on rewrites anyway, so why bother being afraid of something you'll ultimately kill at the end of the day? This was more or less the common consensus among editors in a few panels I've been on in the past. This has happened at a couple of writing conventions I've spoken at. There's a panel where they take 4 or 5 fiction editors, usually acquisition editors who make the decisions for their magazines if a story is worth publishing or not, and put them at a table at the front of the room. Attendees bring the first pages of their stories and take turns reading these pages to the editors, and the editors raise their hands at the point they would have rejected that story. Most short story markets I've worked with require a story to pass muster with 2 or 3 staff editors before either going on to the head editor for an ultimate yes-no decision or going to the rest of the staff for a vote. So the panel is supposed to simulate whether or not any given market would give your story a full read to even have a chance at being published. So at least when I've been in on this exercise, very few of the first pages succeeded with even one of the editors, significantly fewer with 2 or more. Usually an editor's hand would go up after only a few sentences, followed by the rest of the editors within a paragraph or 2. It's not that the editors are impatient, but we were pretending we were in the office reading through our pile of submissions as normal. This means that we were pretending we had hundreds of submissions to look at before lunch. So if a story gives up the game in the first few sentences, that's all it's going to get. And editors read more story openers in an hour than most writers will draft in a year. So they get pretty good at figuring out what you're doing, where it's going, and if you yourself know what you're doing and where you're going well enough that you have a chance to pull it off. Most writers don't, even if they're the kind of writer that plans every page meticulously. I see 3 main strategies that people use in their openings. There are more, obviously, but if I'm reading a pile of submissions, probably like 97 out of 100 use some variant of these. Opener strategy number 1 would be exposition. It began 3,000 years ago when the Dark Lord fell to the first paladin's blade, his shadow fading beneath the mountains upon which his ruin was written. From this, the Order of Paladins first arose, and then the writer goes on the rest of the page about a few millennia of history and eventually mentions a character name that becomes the main character, and by then nobody is reading the story anymore. This kind of thing happens outside of genre fiction too. You just get more mundane backstory. Frederick and Henry were best friends in summer of 93 when the circus came to town, and a little accident with the axe juggler killed 5 or 6 people, including Henry's sister Meredith, who had been an understudy for a world-renowned diva, her death inspiring a particularly poignant performance at the opera that night, so it can be said of Meredith that she was best remembered for someone else singing an entirely unrelated opera. Except, that second opening might actually pass muster with me, as long as that was the only exposition in the story and it didn't fill the rest of the page with decades of backstory about the characters, which is what most stories would go on to do. Honestly, I'm surprised how often people go in for straight exposition openings like this, because it doesn't actually count as the beginning of the story. The story begins when something happens, which in stories that employ exposition as an opener is usually put off so far that nobody ever gets to it. This is why I was talking about chopping off the first page of the story. It's okay to write exposition as an opener as long as one of the first steps in rewrites is to pinpoint where on the page your story actually begins, and then you delete everything that comes before that. If you're going to keep any exposition, it should really be a sentence or two of incredibly well-written, characterized prose that is fun or interesting to read in isolation. You need to keep in mind that every moment of your reader's attention has to be painstakingly hooked and held. I remember that used to sound trite and annoying when I was a new writer, but all I'm really saying is that nobody's under any obligation to pay attention to every boring thing you say. Even if your exposition is important to the plot, you can't just start dryly reciting details and minutiae, which in sci-fi and fantasy is what you call a lore dump, up front and then think total strangers will see the value in that, because frankly, there is no value in it at first. Value is something you give to a story as it goes. If your exposition is seriously that important, you can get into it later when you've earned some patience from your reader or you've gotten them to care enough about, say, Henry's experiences of trauma. That way they will now want to know what happened to Meredith at the circus. And as a bit of an aside, this is probably best given in the form of dialogue, depending on the genre. I don't know if I'll ever talk about this at length, but literary readers tend to see dialogue as a pause in the story, and they want very little of it. And sci-fi and fantasy readers tend to see dialogue as action, and they want a lot of it. So in the case of Henry and Meredith, you tell that in summary voice because it's a literary story. In the case of whatever dark lore trope your fantasy backstory is using, you have it come up in conversation and give your readers a saga or some kind of sage to explain it. I do bet that deserves an episode at some point. Also, it is possible to do an exposition-heavy opener correctly, but it's hard as heck, and I think it pretty much requires a first-person narrator. People tend to fall into exposition, I think, because this is what their favorite epic movies do. Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, whatever. But these succeed because they're movies that come with the unique gravitas of music, imagery, and voice acting that you cannot wield as a writer. When it comes to prose fiction, it's just not in our medium. Maybe if you're writing for a podcast, which I'm working on, and if you ask me nicely, I might let you know how that works out, but not if you're just putting words on a page. So you have to achieve an equal pool in some other way which requires narrative voice, and at that point you're going to need to have such a strong narrative voice that it essentially becomes the complete driving power of your story, and now you're telling a completely different kind of story. I will do an episode on narrative voice very soon, but to put it simply, it requires your literal words to be so interesting to the reader that they almost accidentally end up caring about whatever you're writing about. Maybe you've encountered people who have this talent when they're talking in person, who have such a charisma about the words they choose and the way they talk to you that you listen to anything they have to say, even if they were just reciting the phone book or something. A story based on the narrative voice uses this kind of thing as its hook, and the best way you can go about learning that is to read an incredible amount of poetry, because the kind of linguistic snare I'm talking about is essentially what the entire form of poetry trades in. A poem has however many lines to get you fascinated in whatever cerebral intent the poet wants to inflict upon you, and you can absolutely do this in prose. You can. Not using the same tools necessarily, but beneath all the tools and beneath all the forms is the same human fascination, the same call to empathy and curiosity that becomes the simple impetus to care what someone else has to say. So that needs to be its own episode. Additionally, I'm going to carry this broader subject, how to open your story, on to episode 7. Next episode, we're going to assume that you've either cut off your exposition or avoided writing it entirely, and you've started your story at the actual beginning of your story. This will lead you to either start in media res, that is, beginning in the middle of the story and building out backstories as you continue forward, or beginning with what's come to be called a cold open, where the action just begins and your reader has to keep up with you until they figure out what's going on. These are both great openings that I look forward to talking about next time. Right now, however, it looks like I'm on my way out. So, yet another reminder that I am K, as in K. James D'Agostino, And this has been K Talks Writing, where I give you whatever advice I can, and you take from it whatever you can, to think about your stories, the choices you make, and the efforts you put into telling them, and hopefully it helps you get a little bit wiser. The more experience you get thinking about your stories, making decisions about your stories, and executing these decisions to create your stories, the better your stories will be, and the more skill you'll have in executing this art that we love. Never forget that every word and sentence you write makes you better at this, and just like you've always got improving to do, the best story you'll ever write has yet to be written. My background music is by a composer named Safk, that's spelled S-A-V-F-K. Find more of his music at youtube.com/SafkMusic. As for me, I'm K. James D'Agostino, and you can find me on the site formerly known as Twitter, but the URL is still twitter.com/KTalksWriting, where you'll find links to my writing if you're curious to see if I actually follow my own advice or not. Something else you could do while you're there is tweet at me any questions you have about writing, if it's the craft, the business, or the writing life, and I can try to answer or turn your question into part of an episode. Wherever you're listening to this podcast, please give it a star or a rating or a review or whatever pleases the algorithm of the site and tells whatever machine mind that runs the internet that I'm doing something worth doing. It's pretty important actually, but anyway, while you're at it, please follow and or subscribe so that when part 2 of this subject comes out, you'll know and we can finish up this part of our conversation. Thank you for listening, and bye for now.